Hello, this is Music Tech Help Guy, and welcome to episode 77 of my Logic Pro 10 video tutorial series. In this episode, we're going to master our track, Living on the Run. And originally, I planned on doing a 2 or 3 part series on mastering, but I decided, you know what? I'm just going to put this all in one long video, and so we can wrap up the series with mastering. And that doesn't mean I'm not going to continue to make Logic 10 videos. It just means that the main series, the main Logic 10 series, is going to come to a close today. So let's talk about mastering before we start working in Logic here. Mastering is essentially the preparation and processing and editing involved when you are sort of preparing a song for its final destination, its final media, whether that be CD, MP3, iTunes, whatever. And depending on what your final destination is, you're going to maybe master the song a little bit differently. Obviously, when they were mastering to vinyl, the mastering process included transferring tape over to vinyl and the processing involved in between, and deciding on how wide the grooves on the vinyl should be, and things like that. Nowadays, in the digital realm, we do a lot of just processing to give the song just an overall lift and maybe give it some more body and maybe some more presence. Another thing I want to make very, very clear is that the way I'm mastering in this video is not it's not the de facto method for mastering by any means. When I master in the studio, I use a lot of hardware. I use software that is more optimized for mastering. I don't use Logic. I don't use Pro Tools either. I use sometimes I'll use Logic and Pro Tools just for some of the initial processing, but I'm not using Logic or Pro Tools exclusively for mastering. So the method I'm going to show you today is what I like to call the quick and dirty method. It's basically all plugins, no hardware, and will give you a louder track, a fuller track, and a wider track. And so those are some of the things that we're going to be processing and affecting on the master. The frequency balance, the dynamic range, the dynamic balance, giving the song a bit of a volume boost, and also enhancing the stereo image. Also, mastering includes simple things like just trimming and making sure that there isn't 3 seconds of silence before the song enters. It's pretty embarrassing when if you release a song on iTunes and then you have to wait 3 or 4 seconds for the song to start just because you didn't trim properly. So also, you have to think about the context. Are you mastering a song for an album, or are you mastering a song as a single? If you're mastering a whole album, you want to master the album as, you want to master the entire album together. You don't want to master each track individually, because you want the dynamic and frequency balance between the songs to be somewhat similar. You want it to match. It doesn't mean that the composition or the groove or the feel of the songs has to be the same. It just means that, you don't want one song really quiet and another song really loud, and one song really bright and another song really dull. So you want to sort of match the overall dynamic and frequency balance of the songs on an album as opposed to a single. Here we're just doing a single, so we're okay. It's a bit simpler. And then lastly, one of the things you should do during the mastering process is check your master on every speaker imaginable. Listen to it on both pro and consumer grade speakers. Listen to it on multiple pairs of studio monitors. Listen to it on headphones, good headphones, bad headphones, earbuds, car speakers, your laptop, your iPhone. Listen to it on everything. You want the master to sound good on all media, not just your room with your speakers and your acoustic environment, because that's just going to give you one sort of sound and only one perspective of what the master is going to sound like, and it may sound completely different on someone else's system. All right, so the first thing I'm going to do with my track here, my unmastered track here, this is the same bounce that I bounced out in the previous episode when we finished mixing the song. One of the first things I'm going to do, well, actually, the first thing I want to explain is make sure that when you import this file in, that you change the sample rate and the bit depth of your project to match that of the file. You don't want to down convert the file to 44.1 or something like that, or 16-bit, and then master. you're going to want to master at the same sample rate and bit depth of the file, and then convert the file to whatever format you need it to go to. So the first thing we're going to do after you import the file, of course, is I'm going to do something called DC offset removal. DC offset is essentially when your waveform is not perfectly centered on the DC line, DC standing for direct current, whereas the waveform itself is a fluctuating AC voltage, AC current, or at least the waveform is a digital reproduction of that. The problem with DC offset is if your waveform is slightly offset from the DC line, it means that one side, either the upper or bottom side of the waveform, might be slightly higher or lower. So when you go to limit your track, which we're going to do at the end stage of mastering to get the loudest volume possible out of our track, it means that the top end of the waveform might be all the way up to 0, but the bottom is not quite there yet. And I'm talking about top and bottom, and it sort of seems, parallel to panning and position, but it's not. I'm just talking about the position of the voltage on the actual on the DC line, and how far above or how far below that line it is. So it's actually really, really simple to do DC offset removal. You just double click on the track. It'll open it up in the track editor by default. You go to the file editor. And in the file editor, let me just zoom out so we can see everything here. You just hit Command A to select all, and you go Functions, Remove DC Offset, or press Control D. It'll detect any DC offset. Here we have barely any, 0.012%, and then you say Remove. That's just going to give us a little bit more headroom to work with. Now, no one ever ruined a recording by not using DC offset unless the DC offset was really bad, 5, 10, 20%. What DC offset's usually caused by is just like some sort of like electrical inconsistency in gear, either in the mic, the preamp, the compressor, maybe even the plug-in. And sometimes it'll occur for no reason at all, just because we've summed all these tracks together and the overall average voltage is a bit higher or maybe a bit lower than the DC line. So it's something very simple you can do to buy yourself a little bit of extra headroom and also center the waveform better on the track. The next thing I'm going to do is open up my mixer, Command 2, and I'm going to put my master fader actually out in the arrange area. And the way you do that is you right-click and you say Create Track, or you can press Control T. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is I don't want to create regular fades on my track or on my region. And the reason for that is that I want the fades, like the fade in, fade out at the end of the song, even if there isn't a noticeable fade in, fade out, there's a quick fade in out. I don't want those fades to be processed. So I want the fade to be the last thing that happens to the audio before I bounce it. So what I'm going to do is, instead of drawing in a fade like this, I'm actually going to draw in an automation fade on my master track here, my master fader. So I'm going to hit A to pull up automation, choose volume as the automation parameter, and I'm just going to zoom in and listen for the first sort of audible sound in the track. So we can hear somewhere about here, just after measure 2. Probably can't hear that too well. Let me just pull it up here. Yeah, somewhere in there, just after measure 2. We start to hear that that fade in of that initial effect. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to draw in nice little fade with automation here. Whoops. There we go. And typically for fade-ins, I like to do logarithmic fades. And the way you can do that is you use the automation curve tool, and you just pull up. toward the end of the track. Just gonna go to the very end here. There we go. And then just listen to the end of the song. 1, 2, 3. That's always been the way I do it. I just listen for the very end of the song and then count to 3, and then that's where I'm gonna end the song at. It's just it's not, scientific at all. It's just I'm not counting exactly 3 seconds or anything like that. I count to 3, and then what I'll do here is I usually put an exponential fade in. So just using the automation curve tool, drag down. Actually, that might be just a hair long. There we go. And so the song would end like there somewhere. So, and that just gives us a little space between the next track on the album too, if this is indeed going on an album. All right, so that's that. Let me just hit A to hide that. Just gonna collapse the master fader there. No reason to really have that up anymore. By the way, if I sound like I have a cold or something, I'm losing my voice, so that's why I sound like Kermit the Frog today. I almost didn't do this video today, but I decided to go ahead and just deal with it, and you guys can make fun of my voice later. All right, next thing I want to do is I want to check mono compatibility. This is actually something I should have done in the previous episode before I bounced the mix. I just forgot to. Checking mono compatibility basically means that we're going to temporarily convert this to mono. And what we're going to hear is all of anything that's out of phase between the left and right channel is going to have some phasey sounds, some comb filtering sounds, maybe even some phase cancellation issues. This is something that's pretty common to do because you want your song to still sound okay, even on a mono system that sums the left and right channels together, like a lot of smartphones. A lot of smartphones have one speaker. Now, I'm not in the school. A lot of people are in the school of thought that they actually they mix in mono until the very end. That's not. I mean, that's a good school of thought if you want to follow that. You'll always have mono compatibility. You'll always have minimal phase issues. I don't subscribe to that same school of thought. To me, it's 2014. Stereos are in recordings are in stereo, and if you're not using earbuds at the bare minimum to listen to music, then that's your own fault. That's the way I feel about it. So I'm not saying that I'm gonna change my mix drastically if it doesn't sound great in mono, but I might change it a bit just to sort of reduce some of the phase issues between the left and right channel. I can tell you right now that I'm gonna have some phase issues because I use that sample delay effect on the vocals all over the place. And that effect alone will cause phase cancellation in the vocals. Everything else should be okay, though. There'll be some minor phase issues between the left and right guitars, but everything else should actually sound pretty good. If those issues bother you, then go turn that sample delay off on your mix and rebounce it, and you won't have the mono compatibility issue. So the way I like to check for mono compatibility in Logic is I use a plugin called the Directional Mixer. It's under metering, or excuse me, it's under imaging. I take that back. We're going to come back and use this a little bit later for mastering, but what the Directional Mixer does, what it can do for us for checking mono is we can take the stereo spread and basically make it 0, so it's mono. We're going to use this later as a processing plugin to sort of increase the stereo field, but for now we're just going to narrow this down to 0, and we should hear the track in mono. So let's just take a listen. So you can hear as I pull that out of mono, the vocals really come through a lot better. And the reason why is, like I said before, it's because of that stereo delay effect that I used, or that sample delay effect that I used in the previous episode. So the only thing that's really sounding bad in mono is the vocals, but I'm not going to change it. If you feel like changing it, you can. I'm not going to change it because it doesn't bother me that much. If you're listening to music on your iPhone, then you probably don't care too much about the fidelity of the of the audio anyway. Okay, so I'm just going to get rid of that plugin. That was just to sort of test the mono compatibility. Here, I would say it's not great, but it's not the worst it could be. We're definitely getting some phase cancellation in the lead vocal. All right, first thing I'm going to put on here is the multimeter. It's under metering. We used this a bit before. I'm only pulling this up really just to keep an eye on the correlation meter, which remember shows us the phase between the left and right channels. We want to keep it in the blue and not in the red. It's also going to show us the frequency balance and also our headroom and our levels and volume. So when I hit play here, the dark blue meters are showing us the peak levels, and the light blue meters are showing us the RMS levels. The peak level is basically the top of the waveform here, whatever the loudest volume is at any given point in time. RMS stands for root mean squared, and what it is essentially is the overall loudness or the perceived power or loudness in the mix. The higher the RMS is, the more perceived loudness you're going to hear. The higher the peak is, the more those top levels are going to be. One of the functions of mastering is actually to pull those two values to put peak sort of hitting zero not all the time, but every single time there's like a hard drum hit, but then also pulling up RMS to give the song a volume lift. But we don't want to do it too much though, because we also don't want something that loses clarity. You have too much of a lift. Sure, it's going to be loud. It's easy to make something loud, but it's difficult to make something loud but still have clarity. So I'm just going to keep this meter up just as a reference. The next thing I'm going to throw on here, and actually what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up the mixer here. I'm just going to pull up a little sliver of it over here on the side. There we go. And I'm actually going to put the multimeter on the master output over here. I'm not going to put it on the actual audio track itself. The next thing that's going to come up after the multimeter is I'm going to use a linear phase EQ. I typically don't use too much EQ mastering unless I have to, unless there's something that needs to be boosted, like the high end or low end significantly. Well, you can tell that it needs a boost. Really, you shouldn't do anything significantly with EQ in mastering, so let me rephrase that. What I do with EQs in mastering is I will turn on a high-pass filter, and what I'll do is I will scoop out everything at around 24 or 25 hertz, somewhere around there. And I'm going to make the shelf here, or the slope, I should say, a really narrow slope. So I'm just turning on the high-pass filter, changing the frequency to 25, and then making the slope 48 dB. So why do that? Well, there is a lot of energy in the low range, particularly in the sub frequencies. And there's a lot of energy that doesn't need to be there because we're not going to hear it anyway. And so and some people will even go higher up than 25, they'll go up to 30 even. Then you're sort of cutting into the audible range. But the problem is that there's a lot of sub-low frequencies down here that just don't need to be there. There's no typical stereo system or no typical speaker system or driver or amplifier that's going to be able to play that frequency anyway. You're not going to hear that in your car speaker. You're not going to hear that in headphones. So it's just eating up extra energy that we can repurpose later, get a little bit more headroom, and push the volume of the track up further. So we're just buying ourselves a little bit more energy there. All right, so that's that. And again, I'm using the linear phase EQ because it doesn't have the phase interactions and sort of the coloration and the tone that the channel EQ does. So that's why I'm using that. It causes a little bit more latency, but that's okay. Next up under specialized is the Exciter plugin. Its Exciter plugin is a sort of an Aural Exciter. It basically can boost the harmonics above a particular fundamental. When you boost harmonics, you get a bit of a lift in the overall body, in the presence or in the brightness of the tone. Now, this works really great on guitars if you just throw it just on the guitar tracks. Using it on the master, you're going to want to deal with really, really low boosting, low levels. So the more of this harmonics knob is going to go up, the more of the presence boost you're going to hear. There's also two colors. Color 1 tends to be a little brighter than color 2, and then you can choose whatever the fundamental frequency of the boost is. What I'm going to do is I'm going to put this just below about 2K because I want the sort of range that the vocals and the body of the guitars are in. I want that range to be boosted a bit. So with harmonics all the way down, harmonics up a bit. There you go. I just figured I'd pull it up and sweep it through so you can hear the effect that it has. So I ended up pulling it down just a hair, a bit in the lower range. Actually, I think I'll pull it down even further. Yeah, we'll go with that. Again, I'm going with really, really low numbers here. I'm not trying to. I don't want this to sound like, you know, she's singing through a megaphone. I don't want the mix to sound like it's going through a megaphone. I just want a bit of sort of like a mid-high boost on everything. All right, next up is the multipressor. The multipressor is under Dynamics. And what the multipressor is it's a multi-band compressor. The way multi-band compression works is it splits up the frequency range into different bands. With this plugin, it can split up the frequency range into 4 different bands, sort of like an EQ does. And then you can click on these little white bars and you can set what the crossover frequency between the bands is. And then in addition to being able to boost and boost and cut each band like an EQ, you can actually independently compress each band. So that's really cool. So if you want sort of the mid-range to be a bit more dynamically level, you can compress it a bit more. And if you want the highs to sort of ring out a bit more and have more dynamic range to them, you can compress those less. Again, with mastering, the goal is not to drastically change the track. So I don't want to really hit each of these channels too hard. I'm not really going to use a ratio really any higher than about 5 or 6 to 1. So most of these controls, they look a little foreign right now, but they're essentially the same as any other compressor that we've talked about. What you can do is for each band, you can solo that band. So if I just want to hear the low range, I solo that band. I can, let me just option click on this. There we go. I can add compression to this by increasing the compression ratio right here, and then also lowering the threshold of the compression. I like the fact that each meter sort of gives you a visual of what you're looking at. So when I hit play, the light blue meter is like the input signal. The darker blue meter is the output signal. That's the signal after it's been compressed. So this top little triangle here is actually corresponds with the compressor threshold up here. So you can sort of visualize where you want the compressor to go and maybe have it tap the top of the meter, or maybe have it go dip down a little bit further into the meter. So the other thing that you can do in here is there's actually an expander. I don't use the expander at all because I don't really need expansion. If you mix properly, you don't need expansion. So I'm going to pull the expander threshold all the way down. And with the ratio at 1, it's, the expander is basically off, so you just leave it alone. So let me just hit play here, and I'm going to go through each of the bands and just pull down the compression threshold a bit and pull up the ratio a bit. And the bars up here will show you the gain reduction on each channel too. What I like to do is I like to just make the first band just sort of the sub lows, everything like below 100. 2 and 3 are sort of like the meat of the song, the mid lows, and then sort of the 1 to 5 K range that I told you guys to be careful about boosting too much, and then sort of like your ultra, your upper highs up here. So in addition to compressing each band, you can also add or boost the makeup gain for it. So let me just go through and sort of balance this the way I want it. And this is what I was saying earlier, why I don't use a lot of EQ when mastering, because you can really get the spectral balance, the frequency balance from a multi-band compressor rather than having to do it with an EQ. The other thing we can control is we can control the individual attack and release time of each band. Typically with the upper frequencies, I want more of the transients to come through a bit more. So on band 3 and band 4, I'm going to pull the attack time up a bit just to let the transients come through a bit more, even on 2 a bit. On the sub lows, I want sort of dynamic consistency, so I actually pulled up the ratio a bit. It's got the hardest compression threshold, and the attack time I'm set pretty low because there's really not a whole lot of transients down in this area that really need to come through. Let me just play around with the release times as well. Let me go back a bit here. Yeah, that sounds about right. One last control that's in here is, well, first of all, there's output meters. You want to make sure that you're not clipping it all in the plugin. You can also sort of just reduce the output a bit. If you think the signal out here is a bit too hot, you can pull it down. So I'm going to do that. The next thing that's up is going to be the stereo spread plugin. And that's going to be under imaging, stereo spread. The stereo spread basically splits up the frequency range into these different bands, and then you can pan them left or right. Right now, this is a really, really drastic stereo spread effect. This is not what I want, but I'll play it for you anyway. The problem with the stereo spread is that if I do a really hard spread like this, instruments that were supposed to be in the left might accidentally show up in the right, and ones that were supposed to be in the right might accidentally show up in the left. So when I do use the stereo spread plugin, I only apply it to the highest frequencies, and I also pull down the intensity a bit in the lower range, a lot in the lower range really, and then a bit in the higher range. I just want a very slight frequency spread in the upper range. You can also control the number of bands with the order knob here. So if I pull this all up to 12, there'll be 12 bands. Pull it down, there'll only be 6 bands. So I want as many bands as possible because I want these bands to be really narrow. All right, I think that'll work. There's actually another plugin I'll show you guys later in the video called, well, I already sort of showed it to you once. It's the directional mixer. We'll actually use that for stereo spread later, but for now we'll just go with this one. All right, we're good there. Still not clipping. The last processing plugin I'm going to throw up here is the adaptive limiter. It's under Dynamics, adaptive limiter. The adaptive limiter is a mastering limiter. It's a lot like like something like the L1 from Waves or the L2 from Waves. It's a plugin that sometimes gets overused a lot because some people sort of think of mastering as being synonymous with volume, and it's not always about volume. It's about giving the song a bit of a lift, but at the same time maintaining overall clarity. So there's only 3 controls in the adaptive limiter. There's an input scale. That's the volume of the signal before it goes into the limiter, so you can decrease that a bit if it's too loud coming in. The gain is how much gain just pure volume you're adding to the signal. And the output ceiling in limiters is the threshold. Now, the difference between something like a limiter and a compressor is that a limiter doesn't have a ratio. Well, actually, on most limiters, there is technically a ratio, but it's a fixed ratio. That's usually something like 20-1 or 100-1 or 1,000-1 or infinity to 1. So basically what I'm saying there is that the signal in a limiter will not surpass the output ceiling. And if it does surpass the output ceiling, it's only by a tiny, tiny little bit. So what we can do is set the output ceiling for whatever we want the peak volume of the track to be, and then pull up the gain to get volume and heft out of the track. Again, you don't want to pull it up too much because then you're going to lose clarity. So you got to sort of find a nice spot for it to sit. And if you left yourself a lot of headroom over here when we were mixing too, you're going to have to add more gain, but you're sort of going to be able to preserve the clarity. If you mixed at too loud of a level, you're not going to have much clarity when you add gain to this. So I'm just going to pull the input scale just down a hair. I'm actually going to set the output ceiling at -0.1 dB. That's just a habit of mine because sometimes limiters aren't 100% accurate at keeping things from clipping. And like I said before, some limiters don't have most limiters don't actually have an infinity to 1 ratio, which means that sometimes sound can get slightly above the output ceiling, which if your output ceiling's at 0, it means you're going to clip a little bit, even albeit just by a tiny little amount. So I'll usually set the output ceiling at about -0.1, or somewhere between -0.1 or -0.3. I'll put it on -0.1. So let me start with the gain all the way down, and then I'll pull the gain up, and you'll hear the difference.
We don't have to look too far to see the blinding light.
Now, like I said before, you don't want to really pull this up too much because you'll end up with something like this.
The ruined life behind us is no.
Just get a mix that's just really pounding and just doesn't have any clarity to it. And I still like to see a little bit of a bounce on the output over here. I don't like to see it just all the way up at red all the time. So, all right, so that's the last processing plugin we're going to throw on here. Let me just throw another multimeter on here at the end so we can just compare the before and after. So here's our output multimeter. Here's our input multimeter. Just make these a bit larger here. Let's see what the two look like. After listening to it, I feel like I want to get a bit more of just the mid-range body out of it. Let's pull that up there. Maybe even a little bit more of the high end. So let me just jump back toward the beginning here.
You ruined life for me.
just finding a different position for the exciter there. All right, so let me just turn off the multimeters. I'll play you the before. And the after. So that's pretty nice. Again, we didn't completely change the tonal, the tonal balance of the song. It's not a complete shift away from what the original mix sounded like, but it's just a bit of a lift, a bit more presence, a bit more body, a bit more power. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just select with my cycle mode up here. I'm going to select the range for bouncing, so I'm just paying attention to where my fades were. Here we go, just before the fade. And this one's going to go just after the fade at the end. And there we go. Now, you might think, oh, we're done. Let's just bounce the song. Well, there's one more thing we need to do. And actually, we can do this, in the bounce window. So I'm gonna hit Command B to bounce. You never want to bounce to MP3 and just call it a day. You always bounce to an uncompressed format, so PCM, and choose WAV or AIFF. But you want to convert down to the format that you need for your project. Now, that's sort of a loaded statement there, because if you plan on taking a bunch of masters and putting them in a CD authoring program and then burning them all to disk, chances are the authoring program will actually convert them down to 16-bit 44.1 for CD. In case you didn't know this, regular old CDRs, you can only, the audio on them only can have a bit depth of 16-bit and a sample rate of 44.1. So even if you recorded the song at 24, 48, or a sample rate of even higher than 48, you're still going to have to down convert the audio to a format that works for disk. Even for iTunes, when you send something in just like CDBaby or Bandcamp, it ends up getting converted down to 16-bit 44.1 anyway, so that it can be converted to an MP3 file. So what I'm saying is that in the end, you're going to have to make it 16-bit 44.1 no matter what, unless you're like sending something off for like film or DVD or something like that, where they can take higher bit depths and sample rates. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bounce this out at 16-bit 44.1, which is actually lower than what we recorded it at. And yes, there is a reason why we record higher than what we're going to bounce to, but I could spend a whole video on that, so I'm not going to bother trying to explain that now. What you want to make sure you do is make sure the file type is interleaved, so you get one file rather than two files. And this is the only time you'll really ever have to use the dithering option. I usually just choose the Power Dither 1. Power stands for Psychoacoustically Optimized Word Length Reduction. Basically what dithering does is it adds a not even noticeable, very low level noise to the audio in order to optimize the quality change that happens when we go from 24-bit to 16-bit. The whole point of dithering is to make the downgrading from 24-bit to 16-bit seem like it's not there, so that you can't tell. So, I mean, if you've ever mastered something in the past and you didn't dither, it's okay. No one ever ruined a recording by not dithering, It's okay. It's not the end of the world. It's just something that's pretty common practice. And the only time you really ever want to dither, like I said, is when you're down converting your bit depth. When you're going from 24-bit to 16-bit, or maybe 32-bit float to 16-bit. Those are the only situations where you need to use dithers, when you're converting your bit depth down to a lower bit depth. Sample rate doesn't matter. If you're just converting sample rate, dithering is not an issue. I'm going to make sure that my normalize function is off, because I don't want to normalize something that's already been limited to negative 0.1. So we're going to just leave it. And then I'm just going to do an offline bounce, and everything else looks good, and we'll just hit bounce. I'll just give this a name. I'll call it LOTR master number 1. Okay, so while this one is bouncing, I want to talk about one other method that you can use for mastering in Logic. A plugin, and I got the idea to do this from a plugin that I've used for mastering more recently. I haven't used it for a long time, but it's a plugin called Vitamin from Native Instruments, or not Native Instruments, from Waves, actually. Vitamin from Waves. What Vitamin does, it's sort of like a multi-band compressor. It's not really a compressor, it's more of like a multi-band enhancer that lets you apply different amounts of stereo spread to those frequency bands. So what it does is it breaks up your master into 5 different bands, sort of like the multi-band compressor did, and then you can independently control the spread on each band. The problem with using the stereo spreader is, yes, I can just apply it to the high end, but I can't just shift. Like, let's say I wanted to shift the stereo image to be wider or narrower without actually affecting the frequency balance. You can't really do that with the stereo spread plugin, but you can do this, excuse me, with the directional mixer plugin. So what I'm going to do to get this set up is, first I'm going to get rid of the stereo spread plugin. I am going to bus the output of the audio track to bus 1. It's going to create an aux track for me. And I'm actually going to create 3 more aux tracks. So I'm going to hit Control N 3 times. I'm going to make the inputs on those buses also bus 1. Now, the reason why I'm doing this is, as you may recall, in the multi-band compressor and the multipressor, you can split up the bands just by soloing a band. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to duplicate my multipressor on each of these aux tracks. In the first one, I'm going to solo the low band. In the second one, I'm going to solo the mid-low band. In the third one, I'm going to solo just the high mid band. And the fourth one, I'm going to solo just the high band. So now I've broken up my bands to 4 distinct aux tracks. And I can rename these. I'll just say LF, LMF, HMF, and HF. There we go. Let me pull these down just a hair. And the great thing about this now is, well, first of all, I did tell you guys the rule EQ before compression. Here, I'm not really going to worry about putting the linear EQ on each of these. I'm just going to throw it after after the multipressors. So what's happening here is we're taking the audio track, splitting it into 4, sending it to all 4 of these aux tracks, and then all 4 of these aux tracks are summing down to our master output, which is going to the master fader. So I'm going to go ahead and just leave the exciter right on this track. If you wanted to, you could just throw it on one of the individual tracks, maybe like the mid band where the guitar is, or the mid-low band where the low end of the guitar is. I'm going to keep it just right on the track, though. The limiter I'm going to keep the same. The only thing I'm going to do is I'm going to each one of these, I'm going to add under imaging, the directional mixer. Now, typically, high frequencies, I want them to be more spread out, and lower frequencies, I want them to be more narrow. So that's what we can do now. We can independently control the spread of each one of these channels. So I'm just going to pull up the high frequency spread here. Just jump up a bit. So narrower, wider. They go to the high mid frequency band. Now this band has a lot of the content of the vocals in it, so I'm gonna go pretty easy on it. If anything, yeah, I'm gonna narrow it a little bit more just to make the vocals a bit more defined. On the low bands, I'm actually going to, on the mid-low band, I'm actually gonna spread it just a hair. It sounds a bit boxy in that range and a bit muddy, so one easy way just to sort of break up that muddiness is to do a stereo spread. On the low, like the sub-low channel though, this one I'm really gonna narrow the spread. There we go. Now, the only thing that's tricky about doing this method is that sometimes if you adjust the directional mixer a bit too much, it's going to cause some phasing issues between the channels because you're just sort of haphazardly taking frequencies in a high band, moving them over left or right, but then they're staying in place on another band, and that in itself can cause some phase issues. So you have to be careful about how much you do this, and when you do this, you just do it. You know, just be very careful about making too drastic of changes to the master. And it goes back to what we were saying before. We don't want this. We don't want to change the overall character of the song too much. We want to more or less just give it enhancements, but still maintain the natural character of the original mix. So let me play this back for you. And then this also gives us, now we have 4 faders to control each of the 4 bands. We can add other effects to this if we want to. But again, you have to be careful because the more you deviate from what the original signal was here, the more you're going to sort of start getting phase cancellation issues, which can be detrimental. They can be helpful, but they can also be detrimental. So, all right, so let me just go ahead and bounce this one as well, and then we'll listen to both of them back to back. All the same settings. I'll just call this one Master 2. All right, so while this is bouncing, what I will say is that this series has been a lot of fun to do. I've really, myself have learned a lot about Logic 10, working through 77 videos, actually 78 if you include one addendum video, 78 videos that I've done for this series. It's really been a lot of fun. I've learned a lot about Logic that, I've had to really sort of dig really deep into the depths of the Logic manuals to find some things that, I've used before, but maybe have never tried to explain or teach, So it's been a lot of fun, sort of tapping into that. And, it's been a lot of fun mixing this song. And I hope you've really enjoyed, your time, mixing the tune. What I'm probably going to do in the next episode is it's going to be sort of like a finale episode where I just sort of talk about my thoughts about Logic, maybe give it a rating, things I didn't like, things I did like, what I'm going to do for the future, future Logic videos, what am I going to do? So I'll probably do a separate sort of appendix video for that, just because, as you guys can tell, I'm really starting to lose my voice right now. So I need to let my voice rest a little bit before I do another video. But while we, let's listen to these masters. We shouldn't just leave them unlistened to. One thing just to keep in mind as well is that you shouldn't just create one master for a song. Typically what I'll do is I will create multiple masters, multiple versions for the artist to listen to, and then they can just pick whichever one they like the best. So I'll do like a really loud one, I'll do a really bright one, more of a darker one, a quieter one. So a lot of times, I'll give the artist 3 or 4 or 5 versions of the song, and they can pick which one they like the most. I think I like number 1 the most on this song, just because there's a lot going on in the tune, and I can tell there's some phase issues going on because we did that multi-band thing on number 2. But let's listen to a little bit of each of these. So here's number 1.
We don't have to look too far to see the face of destruction. You ruin life for me. Wait for them to take me quickly when things have been a lie. You've already taken a shot from me. Wait for them to take me quickly when things have been a lie. You're the only thing that keeps me alive. Lord, you lift me up, and Lord, you pull me down. We'll never change our ways. Lord, why can't you lift me high when we're just living on the run? We don't.
All right, that was the first master, and this is the second one. Let's jump ahead a bit.
We don't have to look too far to see the face of destruction. You ruin life for me. Wait for them to take me quickly when things have been a lie. You've already taken a shot from me. Wait for them to take me quickly when things have been a lie. You're the only thing that keeps me alive. Lord, you lift me up, and Lord, you pull me down. We'll never change our ways. Lord, why can't you lift me high when we're just living on the run?
There we go. Yeah, I like the first one better. I think the method we used for the second master might work better for like pop music or dance music, where we need a really sort of hi-fi spreaded sound. For rock music, I just think the spread isn't really adding anything because the guitars and the drums and the bass are really making the song really dense already. So I would go, if I had to pick between the two, I'd go with the first one. So. All right, guys. So I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for putting up with my froggy voice. I hope you've enjoyed the series. Like I said before, the series is not over with. I'm going to keep making Logic videos. This is not the end. This is just sort of the informal end of the main series. I'll continue to make Logic videos because there's still a lot of things that need to be covered. But yeah, I hope you guys have enjoyed mixing the song, mastering the song. And again, if If you want to purchase this session to mix and master it and follow this I think it's 18 or 19 part video series on mixing and mastering, I'll put a link to it in the video description below. So thanks again, guys, for watching this series. I appreciate all of the support. I hope you've enjoyed this series as much as I've enjoyed making it.